consultant and past lead evaluator on the baseline studies for the JTI DRRP project. We started working in Jeffreytown in March of 2016 to do the baseline studies for the pre-phase for the implementation of the project plan. And it really has been quite a privilege to have entered Jeffreytown. We designed the study with 7 components: hazard impact, disaster risk reduction practices, climate change adaptation practices, social environmental implications, physical environmental vulnerabilities and risks, social and gender, and knowledge, attitudes, and practices, known as CAP. The CAP component has been very significant. It is a seminal part of the study. The first part in the baseline involved looking at residents' knowledge of projects, residents' knowledge of how public agencies serve them, how they interact, and so forth. We looked at attitudes towards public agencies, attitudes towards projects, and attitudes towards the value and benefits of projects. And this really has been diverse in terms of the results in Jeffreytown. There are communities that found some things very beneficial, and there are other communities that probably didn't know as much about the project, but are learning about the project. In recent times, we have expanded the CAP survey by doing a random rapid survey analysis in Jeffreytown, and this was really in time for the implementation plan and capacity initiative workshop that took place in Kingston at the Pegasus. And we really had 2 days to do a rapid survey, so we decided to scale it down and make it 1/4 of the size of the original study, which was about 50 persons interviewed rapidly in 9 districts of Jeffreytown. And we went house to house, we visited with people, met with them, and got their input on disaster management, on their preparedness levels, on whether or not they thought that their infrastructure was fit and ready to handle, say, a Category 5 hurricane or any other type disaster. We got views on whether or not people would evacuate to shelters. Are the shelters fit and ready? Do people know where these shelters are? We also try to get people's views on who they thought are the most vulnerable groups, whether men, women, children, the elderly, or the disabled. As far as possible, the study was designed to be gender sensitive, which means we really wanted to look at the respective roles of men and women in disaster management, in responding to disasters, and in terms of their relative resilience levels. We had interviewed a nearly equal ratio of men to women, 56% women, 44% men, and we interviewed persons of all age groups from ages 18 onward to about age 77. The majority of persons were somewhere between the ages of 35 to 55, and we saw an equal distribution of persons who were only educated at the primary level and persons who were only educated up to the secondary level. Only a marginal percentage of persons, 7%, had tertiary qualifications, which is pretty much typical of the demographics in Jeffreytown. So we got diverse views on whether or not people thought their communities in particular had the systems that were necessary for them to manage during a natural disaster. In terms of a hurricane, we looked at early warning systems, we looked at whether or not roads and drainage was fit, or whether or not they had a good evacuation plan, or people were mobilized and trained in search and rescue. All of these things were considered in the CAP. The CAP also tried to capture information on other aspects of responding to disasters. We were thinking of the occupational groups that are impacted by disaster management, and in particular, we got almost a 100%, I think it was at 97.7% confirmation of the fact that the farming class in Jeffreytown, which comprises 78% of the occupational classes overall in Jeffreytown, were the most impacted group, because Jeffreytown has a 79% dependence upon farming and farming income. So we have somewhere between 75 and 78% of the population directly involved in farming, but we have a greater dependence in terms of share statistics on farming income. And this involves women and children who are not particularly farmers, but women and children who depend on farmers for the provision of an income. And so the occupational class most impacted would have been the farmers. Other things we looked at is, where do people get information when they need to update themselves on disaster management, disaster risk reduction, and adaptation practices. And so we looked at, do they go to the radio station? Do they use the local radio and TV? Do they use internet or other forms of social media on the internet? Do they rely on past experiences, or do they just not seek out information? The attitude survey shows that there are a percentage of persons who really don't seek out information, and they think that it adds to the, the depression of an already depressed community, depressed socio-economic situation in Jeffreytown, which is a relatively poor community. The majority of the persons we found looked to local TV and radio, and there were a significant percentage of persons who do check in with the JET office, but the majority of young people turn to the internet and other social media forums for information. So that's basically it in a nutshell. In terms of the CAP survey, there are lots of bits of information that can be elicited from the body of data and the body of work that has been compiled in the baseline studies and in the CAP survey itself. We came up with about 12 or 13 summary findings, but if you probe, we could come up with 30 or 40 different variables that informs us about knowledge, attitudes, and practices in Jeffreytown.